So in this last example, because we're on 3.4 but we hadn't done the last example, this is one that was connected to one we did in section 3.3. Do you remember that one in section 3.3 where we did the horizontal distances and looked from A to B and A prime to B prime, and then the vertical distances and the same thing? And I showed you two methods. One was a lot easier to understand and one was a little bit longer. And that first method that was a little bit longer, I said the reason for doing that is so that when we get to this question, we'll be able to use that technique again. So the difference in this question from the last one is there are stretches and compressions and also translations involved. So to figure out what happens, we first have to figure out what were the stretches and compressions that happened. And we do that by looking at the horizontal and vertical distances between points. So you'll need 2 points on your original graph. So on f of x, we have a and b. So we'll figure out, well, how much horizontally do we go when we go from a to b? Well, we're going to the right, so it's going to be positive, and we're going from 0, 8 to 2, negative 8. So the horizontal distance that we would travel is 2 units. On the blue graph, when we look at a prime to b prime, we're starting at negative 2, and again we go 2 to the right to get to b prime. So in this case, to get from 2 to 2, you could multiply x by 1, but really what that means is there has been no horizontal stretch or no horizontal compression. It just has stayed the same. To check if the same thing has happened with our vertical distances, we again look at a to b on our red graph. And a is at the top and we're going down, so this is going to be negative. We go from 8 down to negative 8, so we've gone down 16. From a prime to b prime, we start at 0 and go down to 8, so we go down again and we go down to negative 8. So there has been a vertical compression. To get from negative 16 to negative 8, you would have to multiply y by a half. So in the last question, we were done at this point. We could write our equation and we would be done. But in this one, we still have to figure out what the translations were. So the next step, and I'm going to write it out in words just so that we have it down in our notes. What we're going to do, and we'll do it in green here, we're going to temporarily apply the stretches, and I'll write stretches slash compressions because it'll be whatever you have in your question. We're going to temporarily apply the stretches, compressions to f of x, which was our red graph. So in our example here, we only have one compression. The y values are going to get multiplied by a half. So if we look at the points A and B on our red graph, and we multiply the y values by a half, can you see that this point on our red graph, which originally was 0, 8, would change to 0, 4 if you multiplied the y values by half. And this point down here, which is B, which is currently at 2, negative 8, if you multiplied the y values by a half, you would get to 2, negative 4. We do that temporary application to those points because if we look at those new green points, you'll be able to figure out how would I have to translate those green points to end up at A prime and B prime. And it should be the same for each point. So notice, for this point here at 0, 4, I'd have to go over and then down to get to A prime. And this one, I'd have to go over and down to get to B prime. And those will be the translations necessary in this graph. So if we hadn't applied the stretches and the compressions, you might think you have to go down 8 to get to A prime, but then that doesn't match up for B. And so applying those stretches and compressions, because that's how we work with things. If you think about the arrows that we've done, we always do stretches and compressions first, and then translations second. So when we figured out what our stretches and compressions were, we can now figure out what our translations are, and we can see from the graph that it's 2 to the left and 4 down. Now we can write our equation. We have all the information. So our equation in terms of F, we've got a vertical compression by half that will be outside the function. We have no horizontal stretches or compressions, so inside the function we're going to have an x, but we have 2 to the left, so we'll write plus 2, and 4 down will show up outside the function as well. So to recap, what we had to do is we had to find the stretches and compressions first. And we did that by looking at the distances between A and B horizontally and vertically, and the distances between A prime and B prime horizontally and vertically. Once we found those stretches and compressions, we temporarily applied them to get those green points, and then those green points, there should be a nice translation that matches for both of them to get to A prime and B prime. And once you found those translations, then you can write your equation. So in the last 10 minutes now, we're going to work on question number 9 or other questions from the previous homework.